Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and I'm presenting the third part, if you like, of my sort of trilogy of YouTube presentations based on my essay entitled When to Retain the Group Name, Defining and Applying the Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple Paradigms. If you've been following along with the text version of the essay, you can always hit the link at the bottom. So what I've done, so this is the third part, the last part. It's been quite a slog, so thanks to everybody who's been following me along here. In the first part of the first presentation, in the first part of the essay, I sort of define the argument a little more precisely, and really that argument is, or the discussion is based on when is it appropriate for bands to keep their name, their moniker going forward when key members have left, right? And so I sort of discuss in framing the argument, this Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple paradigms, sort of the extremes, if you like, Led Zeppelin being an example of a band that carried on in name only as long as the original members were available, whereas Deep Purple was at the other extreme. Deep Purple, an example of a band where the Deep Purple name has carried on through time almost continuously in spite of numerous membership changes. And lots of bands were sort of are actually somewhere in between, right? But one of the things I pointed out with respect to this particular discussion is that it was always a little too subjective for me, at least for my taste anyway. In other words, when fans were debating, if bands should be keeping their name after membership changes or which lineups were perhaps more valid than other lineups, et cetera, I always found that the discussion was always based a little too much on just, you might say, opinion, which is fair enough. I mean, it's a great discussion, it's fun, et cetera. But it's like, well, this lineup was more valid because they had the most hit singles, or I liked them the best, or I thought the performances were better, that sort of thing, right? And I never really totally thought it just didn't have enough substance for me. So I was looking for something that might add a little more objectivity. So I came up with, in my own humble little way, a framework that I think helps us with this discussion. And that's really what I present in part 2. And this framework is really centered around that we need to pay more attention to who were the most creative members within bands, or sort of the creative centers of bands, if you like, as opposed to not worrying so much about the performance side, right? So in other words, by creative, I'm talking about we need to have a look at at any point in time in a band, who are the key songwriters of the band. I think that's by far the most important part of sort of who are the most creative. But also which band members are most highly associated with the production process. So in other words, the producing of the albums and the songs, et cetera. And also, I think related to the creative process is which band members were most involved in the business side of things. So that could be day-to-day business, or that could be more long-term vision sort of thing, right? And my point is, once we can determine which band members sort of have more creative clout within the band, songwriters, producers, or associated with the production process and business, right? Then it becomes clearer when it's appropriate for bands to carry on with their name and when perhaps the name should be retired. In essence, the more band members that you have that are part of the creative center, I think the more you can justify the band carrying on with their name, right? That's sort of what it turns out with. So what we did in the second part, I also started applying this framework to a couple bands. We did it for Black Sabbath, and sort of came to the conclusion, at least by applying the framework, in my view, it's been completely justifiable for Black Sabbath to carry on with the Black Sabbath name throughout basically its entire history, as long as the creative center, that is Tony Iommi, was in the band. And I sort of provide some evidence why I think that is the case, that Iommi is the undisputed creative center. And as long as he's in the band, it was completely justifiable for Black Sabbath to continue to be Black Sabbath. We also applied this framework to Uriah Heep. And I actually came up with, and Uriah Heep was similar to Sabbath and the Deep Purple paradigm in that they had many, many, many changes through time. But I actually came away with a different conclusion with Uriah Heep once I applied the framework. In other words, Uriah Heep could only, I believe, justify the use of the name up to a point in time. And that was actually at the Abominog album, where because there was such a significant change in the creative center of the band, really essentially when Ken Hensley leaves and Mick Box becomes the creative center, that I think it's difficult to justify calling it Uriah Heep after Ken Hensley left, right? So I kind of had a different conclusion there. And that kind of brings us to today where we're going to apply this framework to 3 more bands and see what you think of this. So we're going to have a look at the Megadeth situation. We're going to have a look at the Venom situation and the Kiss situation. There's always controversy around Kiss, of course. So if you're following along by the essay, if that's how you're doing it, I'm at about page 13. Okay, so we're going to have a look at Megadeth. So we're going to apply this framework, trying to understand when it's appropriate for bands to carry on with their names, right? Especially in light of this sort of creative idea, understanding who are the creative centers of bands. And I think that provides more objectivity to the argument as if a band should carry on with the name or perhaps they shouldn't. Okay, so in the world of Megadeth, if thrash titans Megadeth make it through a couple more decades, they might even rival Uriah Heep for lineup alterations. I mean, the way things are going, it wouldn't surprise me. Although, as it turns out, from the Megadeth situation is actually quite interesting. From a moniker continuity perspective, again, keeping the name Megadeth through time, it's really irrelevant. This actually is a fairly cut and dried example, so I wanted to include it because it is sort of yet another sort of illustration of how this can be applied. For all intents and purposes, Megadeth continues as long as Dave Mustaine says so, right? And I don't know, if people out there might disagree, that's cool, send your comments in. But again, from a creative standpoint, I don't think there's any other way to view Megadeth, right? In my view, it's completely justifiable that Megadeth continues to call themselves Megadeth, even though there's been a million different changes in the band. Well, not quite a million, but a lot, right? Why? Because the creative center is so closely associated with one person. Dave Mustaine writes the majority of the songs. Indisputable. Any fan can see that. Just look at the album jackets, look at the credits, and it's Mustaine. Yeah, there's a few co-writing, a few co-writes here and there, but it's almost all Dave Mustaine, right? And again, you can see that, right? So he writes the majority of the songs. He is painstakingly involved in the production process of every Megadeth album. I would say from a fan's perspective, almost to a fault. I mean, Dave's been remastering the old catalog, remixing the old catalog, you know. I mean, from my perspective, it's like, Dave, it was already great, maybe calm down a bit. But anyway, he's totally involved in that, right? And from the business side of things, yes, Megadeth is a big band. I'm sure they have all kinds of people working for them. But let's face it, no business decision is made without Dave's approval. I think we all know that, right? I think Dave runs the show in almost every way. So in spite of the formidable musicians that have played in Megadeth, and just as an aside, can you think of any thrash metal band that's had a more talented array of guitarists run through? I mean, it's incredible. If you look at all the albums of Megadeth, the talent this band has had is immense. And actually drummers and bassists too. But I mean, just at the lead guitar position, right? I mean, Dave's no slouch himself at both end rhythm and lead, right? But he always teams up with an incredible lead guitar player, right? But none of that really matters, right? Doesn't matter how many incredibly gifted, talented people he has in there. It's essentially been one man's vision, right? So of course, people like any band are going to have their favorite eras. I mean, a lot of people are going to look at the longest running lineup of Megadeth being, you know, Dave Ellefson, Marty Friedman, Nick Menza, with of course, Dave Mustaine. That's going to top a lot of lists. So that was the lineup responsible for starting with the 4th Megadeth album. So starting with Rust in Peace. And they were also, you know, then Countdown to Extinction, which commercially was their big breakthrough. That lineup also did Euthanasia, also did well commercially, and then Cryptic Writings, right? And, you know, yes, if there's a second banana in a way in the Megadeth hierarchy, I guess it's Dave Ellefson, who's been in and out. I mean, Mustaine even refers to him as Dave Jr., as a lot of droogies out there will know, right? So, you know, yeah, it's hard to gauge to some degree the importance of Dave Ellefson. Really, he's been in and out. But I don't think it might complicate the discussion somewhat, but the overall trend to me stays the same, because Mustaine's grip was so universally understood right from the band's inception. So right from Killing Is My Business, Business Is Good, 1985, that membership changes were almost ignored by the fan base. I mean, it was really quite something, because most of the time when bands, especially successful bands, and especially when they release some classic albums, when there's membership changes, usually there's a lot of people, hey, what's going on here? I really like that lineup. What's happening? You never seem to see the same kind of debate with Megadeth. It's almost understood from the word go that it was Megadeth in a lot of ways, right? So a good example, I think, most people, I mean, the first album is amazing, but a lot of people are going to point to Peace Sells, but Who's Buying the Second album as maybe the first true classic Megadeth album, right? 1986. But remember, already from album 2 to album 3, so album 3 comes out called So Far, So Good, So What in 1988. And there's already significant changes in the band. We are now, from album 2 to 3, we have a different lead guitarist and a different drummer. Almost right off the bat, right? They only got 2 albums out, and then suddenly there's major changes, right? But it's still called Megadeth, and most people didn't even really bat an eye at that, right? And that just continues. Really, once by the time we get to Risk of 1999, probably their most controversial album. But after that, it's become almost expected that personnel changes will occur in Megadeth after each album, and perhaps even after each tour. Some guys don't even make it through tours. And no one seems particularly bothered by this, which again, I think for this discussion, I think is actually kind of interesting. So most of the more recent Megadeth albums have been well received. I mean, there's been a few of them, maybe some highlights, I guess, at least for me, but I mean, Endgame, 13, Dystopia, well-received albums, incredible musicianship as always, right? And if there has been any criticism levied against Megadeth, it almost never involves, well, you shouldn't have changed the membership, right? It's usually for other things, right? So the Megadeth example is perhaps a relatively controversy-free case study, right? Again, in terms of what I'm trying to do here. In other words, was it justifiable that Dave Mustaine continued with the name Megadeth all the way through, given changes constantly, right? Even after classic albums and stuff like that. And most people don't seem to really worry about that at all. So that raises some interesting questions, at least in my, humble, silly little mind at times, right? So why didn't the purists generate more fuss when musicians just were routinely substituted in Megadeth? Because certainly in other bands, there'd have been a whole lot more rhubarb about this, right? Well, I wonder, and I guess I can only ask questions here. Was it because Megadeth was always viewed as essentially Megadeth, right? In other words, did we view Megadeth a little differently than we do a lot of other hard rock and metal bands? That it was really a solo band. I mean, it's got a cool, heavy name, Megadeth, but really it's Dave Mustaine. And he just continuously surrounds himself with admittedly gifted musicians, but really it's Megadeth, right? So maybe we all accepted that right from the word go. So we never really got excited when he changed members because it's really just his solo band anyway, right? Maybe. Or I also wonder, are the rules different for metal bands, or especially more extreme metal bands? I mean, there's a time Megadeth was considered more extreme. I'm not sure if they are anymore, but I'm just wondering, are the rules different for, true metal bands versus, say, hard rock bands, right? Do we see things a little differently there? I'm not sure. Or perhaps related to that, and I'm wondering if this is maybe closer to the truth as to why we viewed Megadeth a little differently. Is it a generational thing in which older fans, say like old guys like me, we tend to worry about this stuff a whole lot, whereas maybe younger fans got better things to do, right? So you could tell me if in fact that's the case, if younger fans out there especially, it's like, you know what, I don't worry too much about names and musicians. If I like the music, I like the music, and that's as far as I go with it. Well, maybe that's part of it too. I'm not sure. Anyway, it's an interesting little study. And I just couldn't resist throwing a little Iron Maiden into this. I didn't do a complete workup on Iron Maiden, although I certainly could, but I just thought I'd mention a little bit about Iron Maiden. And I think it's appropriate. I'll talk about Iron Maiden sort of in this Megadeth section because it's kind of similar, right? Whether we realize it or not, it actually is. Now, bassist Steve Harris, in a lot of ways, is to Iron Maiden what Dave Mustaine is to Megadeth. Admittedly, Steve Harris is a whole lot quieter about it. Like Dave he's on Blabbermouth, every 3 hours? I don't know. I mean, I love Dave. I'm a huge Mustaine fan. He's one of my all-time heroes, but he talks a lot. Anyway, that's good and bad, I suppose. So bassist Steve Harris has always kept much of the inner workings of Maiden away from the public spotlight, at least compared to Dave Mustaine, that is. but there's never been any question who's in charge when it comes to Maiden, right? I mean, the boss is Steve Harris. Okay, like I say, it's quite similar, and it's really striking in Maiden for me too, because think of, well, you know, right? Who everybody knows about Iron Maiden. Well, for one thing, you've got one of the most important legendary singers in Iron Maiden, i.e., Bruce Dickinson, right? Now, yes, there was a lot of rhubarb about when Bruce left, and Blaze Bayley took a ton of heat for those albums, which I think it's a little sad because I actually like those Blaze Bayley albums, but hey, I know I'm in the minority there. But I'm a big Bruce guy. Like, who isn't? Who doesn't love Bruce, right? But here's the point I'm making. So you got one of the most high-profile metal singers of all time in Bruce Dickinson. You have a legendary frontman he replaced. I mean, there's a lot of people that love Paul Di'Anno too, right? And it's not like Steve Harris does all the songwriting. He probably does the most. I think that's fair to say if you look at Maiden albums. But Bruce Dickinson and Adrian Smith have made huge contributions to the writing in Maiden, right? And Yannick Gars has too, right? But especially, I would say, Adrian and Bruce, right? All that aside, though, there's never doubt that Maiden would continue as long as the boss remained at the bass position, which is another kind of striking thing. Not to devalue bass players, but let's face it, in most bands, bass players are probably the lowest profile of them all, right? He doesn't sing, right? He doesn't play lead guitar. He plays bass. Mind you, he plays bass like a monster. Like, the guy's incredible, right? But again, he's in a traditionally low profile position in hard rock and metal, right? But here he is. He's the boss, you know? Now, granted, why is he the boss? Well, number one, he writes a lot of the songs. Number two, he's most involved in the production process. I did make a comment about that a little bit in part 1 or 2 as well, right? And he's the king of the business side of the Maiden sort of situation, right? So with Maiden, as with Megadeth, membership modifications never impact brand status because of the band's unquestioned hierarchy structure, right? So in other words, Maiden will be Maiden as long as Steve Harris says it's going to be Maiden. And it almost doesn't matter who's in the band, even if you've got somebody even Bruce Dickinson, doesn't matter, right? Because he's the boss, just like Dave is. All right. Now we're going to go to another extreme. So while Megadeth and Maiden, to me, although they're interesting in their own right for different reasons, but it's a pretty, it's a pretty cut and dry, I think, argument as far as it's completely legitimate that those names carry on as long as those two central figures are there, right? Venom's a whole different ball game. So what I'm going to do with Venom, I'm going to go through it, and I've actually made a little table because Venom actually is really quite confusing unless you're a hardcore Venom fan, which I'd like to think I am. But unless you are, this stuff gets hard to follow. So I've made a little table that we'll look at too, because I think it's fun, but I'm a little odd too. So anyway, Venom, the original incarnation of Venom that spawned Welcome to Hell, black metal, At War with Satan, and Possessed, and in so pioneered the black metal and to some degree thrash subgenres, was initially something close to a true democracy, or at least led by 3 chief supervisors. Okay, a couple things to unpack there. Number one, have to say this. Whether you like Venom or not, and I know there's probably as many people who like Venom who don't like Venom, they have always been very polarizing. You cannot deny their influence. Venom is one of the most influential bands, especially in extreme metal, that probably ever lived, right? In fact, I have an essay that you can check out if you're into that, where I talk about the importance of extreme music, whether you like it or not. And I think that's maybe the interesting part of that paper, that even if you don't like Venom and a lot of the bands that they influenced, like Mayhem and Emperor and et cetera, the whole black metal genre, right? Even if you don't like any of that stuff, extreme music's still really important to even the more mainstream metal fan. So anyway, you might want to check that essay out where I talk about this stuff. But okay, so back to this. The original Venom that spawned these really influential albums, right, was initially something close to a true democracy. As I said, that doesn't happen very often. I think I mentioned that in earlier presentations. Most bands really aren't democracies. Usually there's 1 or 2 members that are clearly, the bosses or the creative centers, as I put in this framework, right? Indeed, so we got 3 original members. You got Kronos on vocals and bass, you got Mantis on guitar, and you got Abaddon on the drums. And they shared in songwriting duties and by all outward appearances significantly contributed to all things regarding Venom. Now, admittedly, Abaddon's songwriting credits diminished after the third album, but his role in production, promotion, and general business affairs appeared at least equal to what Kronos was doing, right? So I think they all shared fairly equally as creative centers initially with Venom. So when things began to fracture after Possessed and numerous variations on the original Venom structure occurred through time, lots of confusion ensued, right? And moniker rationalization became difficult to reconcile. So, I mean, the first four albums, I mean, no issue. The original members were all there. And then we start to see a million variations on Venom, and it becomes really difficult to justify, you know, when is it still Venom? When is it not? Because members are coming and going. And you've got this added dimension with Venom that I would argue they started off as something close to a true democracy, right? And so it becomes harder to see, you know, which variations of Venom going forward can you justifiably really call Venom and which are maybe not so much really Venom, right? Okay, so we're going to run through the changes. Like I say, it's a little dizzying. So we're going to look at a quick table I made to summarize this a little bit for you at the end, if you're kind of digging this. So anyway, the first major change after, that breaks up the original members, at least for the first time, occurred around the time of Calm Before the Storm. It was a 1987 album called Venom, right? In which Mantis, the guitarist, is replaced by two guitarists, Mike Hickey and Jim Clare at the time, okay? And then about a year later, right? So things start to really shift around a lot here. Roughly a year later, Venom is significantly restructured again, but this time Kronos is out and Mantis comes back, right? So now you got Mantis and Abaddon as the original members, and they're joined by Tony the Demolition Man on vocals and bass. Awesome. I mean, I love that original version of Venom, but the stuff that Tony does with him, Demolition Man, is killer too. Anyway, so Mantis, Abaddon, and Demolition Man. Now you got two of the three of the original members with Demolition Man. They were quite prolific. They released the Primeval album, Temples of Ice, and Wasteland. So between 1989 and 1992, they released 3 albums, and they're all really good. They're hard to get these days, but if you can find them, they're worth especially Primeval, really worth checking out. And then there's a reunion. So a couple of years later, Venom's a little quiet for a couple of, during that time, Kronos did put out a solo album, but I kind of kept that separate for now. A reunion of the original lineup is unleashed, called Cast in Stone. It was a 1997 album. So again, now you got the 3 original members back again for at least a little while. So Kronos, Mantis, and Abaddon are on this album. And then they released Resurrection a couple years later in 2000. Abaddon's out at this point. It's just Mantis and Cronus at this point. And soon after that, Mantis and Cronus realize that they have another impasse. They can't work with each other and blah, blah, blah. And they never have worked with each other since then. That is a significant point in time as we're going to see that 2000 Resurrection album. Okay. But just to carry on with the history really quickly. So by the time of Resurrection, Abaddon is out and is replaced by Cronus's brother, Anton. Okay, so that completes that lineup. But as I said, soon after, Mantis and Cronus, they no longer get along, so Mantis is gone. And so since then, we've had Venom albums in which Kronos is the only original member, right? And they released a lot of albums. So they've released with various guitarists and drummers, although the lineup has solidified a little more recently. So they put out Metal Black, Hell, Fallen Angels, From the Very Depths, Storm the Gates. For what it's worth, I think they're all really good albums, right? But it's debatable if they're truly Venom, but we'll get to that in a second. Since 2011, this lineup has, as I said, solidified around Kronos. So you got guitarist Rage, or sometimes referred to as La Rage. His name is different in some of the albums. And drummer Dante, who replaced Anton, Cronus's brother, after Hell. Okay. Completing, frankly, a very fine version of the band, at least in terms of performance. Okay. On the other side of the street, so to speak, Mantis, Demolition Man, and Anton, yes, Cronus's brother, so he kind of shifts sides, which is kind of weird in its own right, I guess, form the equally great Empire of Evil, notably releasing Hell to the Holy in 2012. They released other stuff. A lot of it was compilations and sort of reworking of old songs, but this was all new material. And then I guess most recently, Mantis, Demolition Man, and Abaddon, at least for a while, restructured as Venom Inc., not to be confused with Venom. So now we got a Venom and a Venom Inc. And they produced, frankly, the really great album called Ave in 2017. Yet as of today, essentially, Abaddon has been fired or he left. I don't know, depending on your point of view, and they don't like each other anymore, etc. But Abaddon has threatened to form his own revision of Venom Inc. I'm not sure which. So at some point in the future, we might have no less than 3 concurrent bands playing Venom tunes, and they'd be out there. So I don't know if you can ever get too much of a good thing. We might be getting close to that. I'm not sure. Okay, so just real fast here. Here's this nifty little table I was threatening about. So here we are. Again, I won't go on and on about this, but just to sort of summarize all the changes, because it's really been quite chaotic in the Venom world. So here you've got Welcome to Hell, Black Metal, At War with Satan, Possessed. So from 81 to 85, no real controversy here. It's all 3 original members, right? So what I've got here is the album, the year, and the original members. Okay. Then we get to Before the Storm. Mantis is out, and we've got Abaddon and Cronus as the two original members, right? In addition to 2 other guitar players. Then we got Primeval, Temples of Ice, and the Wastelands. So this is Cronus is out at this point. Mantis comes back, and we've got Abaddon and Mantis with the Demolition Man, right? That lineup. And then we got all 3 members back again for Cast in Stone. And then we've got, then Abaddon is out for Resurrection. We've got just Cronus and Mantis. So again, as I'm going to argue, this is the crucial point in time for Venom. I think it's completely justifiable that no matter, even though we got all kinds of lineup changes up to 2000, as you can see, I think it's completely justifiable they're calling it Venom up to here, because you got 2 out of 3 of the creative core. I mean, remember I said I think Venom is a democracy, or was at one point. So I think you're good here. Once it's just Cronus, in other words, just 1/3 of the creative core, I think it's harder to justify, even though this is called Venom, right? And then as you can see with Venom Inc., at least for a little while, you have Abaddon and Mantis, which creates an interesting irony, which I will summarize in a second, that again, if you're kind of applying it to this framework I've been talking about, as it turns out, you could make a strong argument that Venom Inc. is actually more Venom than Venom. Yeah. Okay. So to wrap up this, for the record, I guess you can probably tell by my enthusiasm, I am a big fan of all things Venom. I especially like things that have Mantis or Cronus, but I really like stuff where they're both together. But anyway. Yet how much of this can be defended as categorically Venom? Well, again, using this creativity yardstick, there are reasonably clear points in time where moniker utilization is quite logical, right? I realize that since the 1985 breakup and for most periods thereafter, it gets really hard to dissect this, because if you, again, you can just check out the YouTube presentations, but all 3 original members are really, I would argue, they're almost rewriting history in some ways. And I won't pick on any one of them, but they're all basically downplaying what the other members did in the past, right? So it might be hard to say, well, who really was writing the songs or et cetera, because they're all saying, well, I did it all, they didn't, and whatever. It's hard to read, I get it, right? So as a fan, I'm going to stay with my original premise that in the early years of Venom's existence, so Welcome to Hell, Black Metal, and At War with Satan, before all the bad blood hit, the 3 original members appeared roughly equal in creative clout. So I'm going to stay with that. Really, that's what the evidence points to that anyway, right? Before you get into all the mudslinging, that's sort of what it seems to look like. So because I'm using that and I'm sticking with my framework, then when 2 out of 3 of the original creators are together, the strongest argument for maintaining the Venom namesake can be made, right? Otherwise, I don't know how you defend any of this, right? So that's what I'm saying. Even with all the changes that occurred after 1985, I think when we see the Venom label on everything up to and including 2000's Resurrection, I think it's completely valid. I think that's fine, because you got 2 out of 3 of the creative centers in the band. After that, it becomes really hard to justify. The situation gets convoluted. And like I say, somewhat ironically, you could make the argument that Venom Inc., at least as long as Abaddon was in it, and that didn't last long, was probably more Venom than Cronus is Venom right now anyway. It's confusing. All right, let's wrap this up with Kiss. How do we apply this to Kiss? All right, also quite controversial. Kiss is always controversial. Maybe it's because of the fervor of the Kiss Army, or perhaps it's just a result of being such a high-profile act. But the membership change versus longevity discourse seems to peak when the conversation turns to Kiss. I'm sure any Kiss fan will have these discussions all the time. How many times have you heard the proposition that without Ace Frehley, especially, and Peter Criss, there is no Kiss, right? It was bad enough, in the opinion of many, when Vinnie Vincent, Mark St. John, and Bruce Kulick dared take over lead guitar duties from Ace, right? But it was a new level of audacity to some people when Tommy Thaler aped Ace's costume and his guitar style. So it's one thing when you got to look like the Spaceman. It's another when you just deliberately just try to play exactly like him. Like at least, Vinny and Mark and Bruce, played their own style. So that's one thing in replacing Ace. But now this guy is basically just trying to be Ace. So a lot of people, okay, this is getting crazy. Anyway. And there were also grievances directed towards Eric Carr and Eric Sainer in replacing Peter Criss as well. But I think the discussion was always not quite as intense for that. Having said all of that, though, for me, it's always been a non-issue. Although I will admit, we'd all be better off if Tommy Thaler would play like Tommy Thaler. But that aside, the fact that Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons have carried on as Kiss in various configurations, to me, is 100% completely justifiable. Again, applying this framework about creative centers. Although their future plans may take things too far in some respects, I'll get to that. It wouldn't be Kiss if you didn't take things too far, right? Okay, for a word or two on the Ace Frehley phenomena, because I want you to know where I stand on this. I don't want you to think, well, he's saying that because he doesn't think Ace is any good. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? But I realize Ace is controversial. Some see him as grossly overrated and famous only because he was part of a gimmick band, while others recognize him as a genuine guitar hero responsible for inspiring legions of hard rock fans to first start playing guitar, basically. First time you pick up a guitar is because you saw Ace. Lots of people say that. I am firmly on that side of it. As far as memorable solos go, I put Ace right up there with Blackmore and Schenker. Yeah, I know what I just said. And I am, for the record, I am a huge Richie Blackmore and Michael Schenker fan as well. I just think Ace is that good. I think when it comes to memorable melodic solos, he's one of the all-time best. So I had to get that out there because I don't, because what I'm going to say after that seems like I'm dissing Ace, and I'm not. I am an Ace Frehley fan, all the way through. Frankly, though, I believe it's absurd to think that Kiss should have ceased once the original Spaceman moved on. Right? I think that's I've never even thought this argument was even controversial, even though it is to so many people. Right? I always thought this one was clear. But again, applying my approach, I think it gets hard to argue, actually. Okay, granted, in the early days, all four original members were essential in developing the Kiss image as well as the Kiss sound, Ace and Peter, right? Yet from a songwriting and business perspective, as I'm always arguing, this is the Stanley and Simmons show. It is, right? Ace and at times Peter produced some terrific songs. I'm not arguing that. I mean, who doesn't love Parasite and Cold Gin, right? But they were far from prolific. And just for fun, I kind of crunched a few numbers here. The median number of songs that Ace wrote or co-wrote on each album during his time in Kiss. So that goes from the first Kiss album, 1974, to Music from the Elder, 1981, and also includes Psycho Circus, which is sort of a Kiss album. I mean, that's an argument for another day. The median number of songs Ace wrote on all those Kiss albums is just 2, right? So median, I'm sure as you know, is sort of like the average, right? So on most Kiss albums, Ace wrote either 1, 2, or 3 songs, sometimes none. Rock and Roll Over, for instance, I don't think he wrote anything, right? So he wrote or co-wrote, right? Only 2. And Peter Criss's median's even less, all right? On the other hand, Simmons and or Stanley songs will always make up the majority of any Kiss album. Typically, it's 80% or more. So again, you can just crunch the numbers yourself if you want. But if you pick Kiss albums and add up the number of songs that were either a Stanley or Simmons, or sometimes together, sometimes they co-wrote, not that often, usually they did it alone, right? Or with other co-writers too. But if you add that up, it's always 80% or more, sometimes 90%. right? Moreover, while Simmons has generated considerable ruckus over his business acumen, I mean, he has this reputation of the businessman. It's also he is, I guess, but it's also very clear that not much happens in Kiss land without Stanley's approval. I mean, Frehley and Chris have perpetually remained on the periphery of the creative center. No matter how much you might love Ace, and Peter for that matter, that is indeed fact. Okay, I don't know how you could argue it any other way. So in my view, the current lineup of Simmons, Stanley, Eric Singer, and Tommy Thaler is as valid as any other Kiss arrangement. You might like the Ace versions better, I know I do, but they're not any less valid, is sort of my point from a creative standpoint. But here's where it goes too far, I think. However, the musings emerging from the Stanley-Simmons axis regarding the never-ending future of Kiss, I think is much harder to defend. Okay, again, applying this creative framework. Both have floated the idea, both Stanley and Simmons have been talking about this quite a bit over the last year. They both think that Kiss could or perhaps should continue as a touring band, and I guess conceivably even a recording entity with no original members. They see no reason why someone else could not be the Demon or the Star Child, or I guess the Spaceman, etc. Just as a multitude of actors have played other superheroes, just like Batman, Spider-Man, etc. From a creative standpoint, there is no way you could take this seriously, though. So if we apply the framework I'm talking about, you can't take this even close to seriously. Just let me throw out a scenario just for a second here. Although lawyers would extinguish this in a microsecond, let's just pretend that somehow Vinnie Vincent was able to lead a version of Kiss. Again, they would snuff that out like in a minute, but let's just say somehow he could, right? Vincent was obviously subordinate to Stanley Simmons, right? But he did make important contributions to Kiss for a period of time. He was actually the key writer on both Creatures of the Night and Lick It Up. And he wrote a lot of important songs, even on Revenge and albums like that. So there was a time Vinny was actually really quite important. Always subordinate to Paul and Gene, but he had his role, right? But I would submit, while neither version you can justify, but I would submit even this Vinnie Vincent version of Kiss would actually even be more legitimate than having a Kiss, wearing the makeup and everything, but with no original members. I think that's the lowest of legitimacy, right? In my view, right? So why is Gene and Paul saying these things? I'm not sure. Perhaps Stanley and Simmons are circulating this notion to retroactively legitimize their use of other musicians to play the role of Spaceman and Catman. That's what Ace has been saying. He said the reason they're saying this is because it justifies them letting Tommy Thaler basically play my role kind of thing. That could be. Or maybe it's just some grand scheme to make Kiss immortal, right? Neither matters, right? Kiss has always been completely authentic with Stanley and Simmons, as I've been arguing, right? And when they retire, the Kiss legacy is ensured as any other band in history. They're going to be as well known as the Beatles for as long as the Beatles or the Stones. I'm convinced of that, right? So as a working, ongoing, creditable entity, every group reaches its end, right? I guess Stanley and Simmons just are coming to terms with that. And that point effectively, if not actually, occurs when you have too few centrally creative members involved, as I've been arguing. So a band really ends, I guess, in a nutshell, when you don't have enough creative centers left to justify it going forward, right? Okay, wrapping all this up. An intriguing discussion, but does it matter? Well, probably not. This is just a big academic exercise by a fanboy. Hopefully you found some of this interesting, but that's kind of what we're dealing with, I guess. In this essay, I've gone to some length to provide a little more structure to the long debated query of under what circumstances can bands legitimately carry on with their moniker. Hopefully this was somewhat entertaining. Thanks to anybody who checked this all out. I really do appreciate it. Of course, this is from a fan-centered perspective. I can only assess what appears reasonable, right? While it is likely that most bands do care at least to some degree what their fans think, there is no question that at the end of the day, legal rulings and commercial motivations are ultimately going to dictate the longevity of a group's name. So I can ramble on forever about this creativity argument framework I'm making and all that, but really it's going to come down to legal and money when you get right down to it. So I'm going to leave the last words to Tony McVie. guitarist and vocalist and undisputed leader of the legendary group The Groundhogs. Great blues rock band if you've never checked them out. And this quote is taken from the liner notes of the Crosscut Saw and Black Diamond CD. Great albums to check out if you don't know them. And the point is that Tony McVie, he's always tried to break free of the name The Groundhogs, but realized for commercial reasons, that's really kind of hard to do, right? And here's what he says. And the daft thing was that when we were doing the Half Moon, so a pub basically in London, as the Tony McVie band, we did pretty well. We got 200 people in there. But when we called it the Groundhogs, the legendary name, right? Doing the same set, same songs, everything, we got 500 people. It's stupid, right? So as I say, all of this stuff, probably just a nice academic exercise a trip that I've been on. Ultimately, as always, it's money and legal things that are really going to dictate if a name continues or not. So if you really like this stuff, maybe try to apply that framework that I've presented to the Blue Oyster Cult situation. Maybe look at Foghat, Budgie, Mayhem, Alice Cooper. Give it a shot. Maybe someday I'll do a workup on those too. Who knows? Thank you so much for listening. Have a fantastic day.